Good morning to you, and if you have your Bible, if you'll turn with me to Hosea, the Old Testament prophet Hosea, and we're in chapter 2, verse 2 this morning. I'm reading from the English Standard Version this morning, Hosea 2, verse 2, and we will read down, Lord willing, to verse 13 and look at that this morning. Hosea 2:2, plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband, that she put away her whoring from her face and her adultery from between her breasts, lest I strip her naked and make her as in the day she was born, and make her like a wilderness, and make her like a parched land, and kill her with thirst. Upon her children also I will have mercy, or have no mercy, because they are children of whoredom. For their mother has played the whore, and she who conceived them has acted shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers, who gave me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, and my oil and my drink. Therefore, I will hedge up her way with thorns, and I will build a wall against her, so that she cannot find her paths. She shall pursue her lovers, but not overtake them. She shall seek them, but not find them. Then she shall say, I will go and return to my first husband, for it was better for me than now. And she did not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, the oil, and who lavished on her the silver and gold, which they used for Baal. Therefore I will take back my grain in its time, and my wine in its season, and I will take away my wool and my flax, which were to cover her nakedness, and I will uncover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and no one shall rescue her out of my hand. And I will put an end to all her mirth, her feasts, her new moons, her Sabbaths, and all her appointed feasts. And I will lay waste to her vines and her fig trees, of which she said, these are my wages, which my lovers have given me. And I will make them a forest, and the beasts of the field shall devour them. And I will punish her for the feast days of the Baals, when she offered burnt offerings to them, and adorned herself with her ring and her jewelry, and went after her lovers, and forgot me, declares the Lord. Well, I want to tell you, whatever version you're reading, you may have found some of the similar words here in this version, as in some of the other versions. You find the word whoring and these are, of course, words that bring a little chill to us when we hear them. We don't say them too much, but the idea is that this is an adultery. She's an adulteress. She committed adultery. That's the word in old times, and it is an appropriate word in God's eyes. Israel has done this. Anytime the words are used, they're typically used in the Bible, which is always a shocking thing to people. They're used, those adultery words are used in the context of describing Israel, the chosen people of God, chosen by Him, of course, that they have left Him somehow. So this metaphor that out of this whole book, Hosea, we see a lot of metaphors and a lot of illustrations and allusions and things that are illustrating things. And this is a man, his wife, and their children, and the times, and they're illustrating really the greater people of Israel. So she represents Gomer, that is, the wife of Hosea, and the children, the family life there represents what God sees between Him and His people. And that hasn't changed, and that group of people becomes all the people that's always of God, in the sense that people, whether they were Israelites or Hebrews, or today modern day Christians, we're the ones in the book of Revelation, and the ones that the book talks about in the end times, and all the other things that relate mostly to this adultery, is that, because that's the picture God uses to illustrate. Paul uses it, the family, the husband, the wife, as an illustration of the perfect relationship. Of course, we all as human beings and sinners live in a world of sin, and so we don't have a lot of perfect relationships, that, if any, that are sometimes, and maybe we have drastic, terrible ones in family life and marriage and stuff. And so we should take that for a moment and stop and say, okay, that we're illustrating how we want it to be, how we thought it was going to be, how it should be, whether we're on whatever side we're on, that's what God was trying to say. I'm your husband. I'm the one, and in that sense, that married you and chose you, as it were, and you have left me. And so that's what this is out. Hosea is illustrating something that happened a long time ago among the Israelites and God. And this is what God has, and he's not doing it because he dreamed it up. God gave him this whole actual family, actual real people, his children, his wife. And previously we looked at how his children were prophetically speaking of what was going to happen in the future. And so we keep that now. We remember last verse and the last part of chapter 1, first part was kind of this respite, if you will, this promise to kind of come back, and that God would help the people, or they would come back to him. That, as I said then, I say it now, I said that's where everybody wants to be. We always, when we are confronted with, generally speaking, when we're confronted with some sort of failing, we want to be restored. And that's true, and we should. And the good news is God wants to restore us. So don't ever lose sight of that. That's the whole reason that even comes up, is that God wants it. He wants to do that. But that doesn't mean there are no conditions, or that he's stuck with it. I'm always fascinated by that idea that somehow because God said he would do something, that somehow or there are no conditions to the doing, that somehow that releases everybody. We can do whatever we want to, and God has to stick. In other words, we get to do what we want to. We don't have to answer to anything, but God has stuck with that, and I don't think that's an accurate understanding. So what is the problem? Again, what's going on here, this adultery is actually in the life of Hosea's family. Gomer, his wife that he chose, was already doing these things. She was already a Baal prostitute. It was Baal represents this group of gods that the Canaanites had, the people of the land had for years and centuries, and they had these elaborate systems to worship the god and to bring favor. This, generally speaking, these are gods that are associated with fertility in the family as well, but more particularly in the products in the agricultural environment that the Canaanites lived in. They were agricultural people, and they had created this whole system that had been over centuries of these gods who were in charge of the rain, the gods in charge of the crops, the gods in charge of the crops fertilizing, and growing and producing and all that. So they had come to that, and they had developed this elaborate system of worship that probably in some ways we were like, what? No way. But they had these prostitutes in the temple who were both male and females, quite frankly, and you performed certain acts with them, which was, the point was not necessarily just the sexual gratification and all that kind of stuff that we immediately fly to in the 20th, 21st century, but the idea was to appease the gods. And that was the point. And so to have that, you had to have people who were willing to be those people who worked in the temple to do that with whomever came along with in an act of worship. And so in their mind, that's what they're doing. So Gomer was already there, and when Hosea chose her to be his wife, because God told him to choose one of these people, then obviously she was chosen, and she continued to do what she had always done. And God uses this illustration to illustrate Israel, his people, and they're chasing after false gods. And how did this start? Well, when did it start? Well, it started a long time before this. And quickly, I want to say that ever since the Israelites came into the promised land, they have been flirting and working their way up to where they were today. They've been flirting with other gods, in a sense, put a word on it. And here it's Valentine's Day, so I guess we can use that word. They were flirting with them, and as you do that, you end up often falling into more than just flirting. It becomes more of a relationship, and then it evolves down into the central thing here, so where they become completely enmeshed in these gods. Now, this is not a new thing, so the reason I point that out, because I'm going to get right to what matters about us really quickly here, but so I want you to understand, because it sounds like something that we don't know anything about, but we do. They were doing this. They went, and why would they even do this? Well, if you remember, and if you don't go back and study, that the Israelites, really the people of God that were chosen out to come out and be his people and to go into the promised land, they were not really agricultural people. They were nomadic people who traveled around with herds, yes, but not growing crops per se, but traveling around with their different with their animals to produce. So they were animal husbandry, but not agricultural in the sense of growing crops. So they go into this promised land, and I keep saying that because I think it's important to remember that God promised them a lot of things. He'd give them this land, and they would be fine, and they would multiply and do all this stuff. And so that they go there, and these people who were already there, right, they were agricultural people. They didn't tend to move around. They tended to stay in one place. They tended to grow crops, and this was all new. The Israelites didn't understand that. They didn't know how that worked. And if you're new and you go to a new job, you don't know how it works, and you don't really have the skill set for it. So they begin to, over a period of time, begin to look at, how do you grow this stuff? Well, they said, well, we worship this god Baal who does these things. And he does this, and this god, this group of the Baals were really a group of gods who does this and who does that. And this is how come we have these crops. And of course, the Israelites were anxious they needed the crops, they were anxious to do it. So they immediately, quickly over time, started to kind of integrate and learn how to grow crops. And they began to connect the dots and say, well, it must be because of this God and that God, just like everybody else. It was kind of a gradual change to adopt these ways of the culture of the people they went to. Now, if you go back and remember, and I won't go back there and dig it all out for you, but the fact is, God says, this is going to happen. You're going to come into this land, and there are going to be some temptations here. And you're going to need to fight against them. You're going to need to remember what I promised you. That's why I said it's the promised land. When you remember what God has promised, and you go over that in your mind, and you look at what the world says that has to happen, what the world wants to tell you, this is how you get this, and God says, I promise you, I'm going to see that things happen. Now, he doesn't necessarily give you all the details. I'm going to, have you take a left step this way and a right step that. He's not going to do that. God says, this is what I promise you. And so then we forget, because then we start seeing this other stuff. And one of the things that God had said that helped you to distinguish, well, maybe God's going to promise to give me all this stuff if I follow these other gods. Well, here's a help for when people start thinking that. God told them the Ten Commandments. The first one is, have no other gods. Don't take up any other gods. And so immediately there's a word for this, and it applies all the way across time. It has a broad explanation. In this context, we'll deal with it. But it's called syncretism. It starts with S, has a S-Y-N-C-R-E-T-I-S-M. Syncretism. Syncretism is really a blending together of something. In the case of, in a secular sense, it's a blending of loyalties. It's a taking a loyalty here and another loyalty and trying to put them together so you can maintain both of them. When in fact you really are violating each one. Okay, it's when you're trying to put two things together that cannot be brought together, but you do that and you're trying to keep both of them. That's blending, that's syncretism. In this case, what they were doing was they're trying to, and they were attempting to, blend, and they did blend together the worship of Yahweh, God, their God, the true God, the only God, and these Baal gods. Big G God, little g gods. Okay, so that's what they've done. And over time, they had become very sophisticated and very much enmeshed into this, and they had basically conned themselves. I say con. They basically talked themselves into the idea that this was totally possible and totally fine. And part of the reason that they had come to that conclusion was, at different times, but particularly in Hosea's time, is because they had been doing so well. They were prospering. So this is always watch out, because when prosperity comes, don't forget how. And this goes back again to God warned them, said, now when you start doing really good and everything, don't forget. Don't forget. Okay, so what does this passage tell us? What's it going to teach us? It's going to teach us a path of judgment, or a path to judgment. A path of judgment or path to judgment. What do I mean? There's always a path. There's always a road, and it starts off together. Remember, they came in as God's people. God gave them the land, and they come into this other area, this other culture, and God had a path for them to walk, but they started to hear side by side kind of because this was going on. And then the next thing you know, instead of taking God's path, which would have diverged, took them away from this stuff, right? They instead merged their paths together. It's a call to repentance. A path to judgment, when one is started down a road that is going off a cliff, that is a warning. As the signs keep getting closer and closer to this cliff, there's a warning to turn around. That's what repentance is. Turn around and go a different way. And that's what this is all about. It's if you understand this as a path of judgment, then you will understand this as a call to repentance. If people keep warning you that you're headed down the wrong road, then the warnings are there to give you a chance to turn around. So what is the path? Well, let's quickly look at it as we think about it, so we can recognize. Because one of the important things is get the road signs, right? Got to recognize the road signs. Now here, remember, where God is through Hosea, is using Hosea's family life and real human people in his life, and as an example to the people around him and to us today. So we get that. But it is standing, and always did, because God is doing that. He said that. It stands for the relationship between God's people, right, and God. First thing is we see repudiation. Verse 2 is a repudiation verse. He is repudiating them. What does that mean? Well, in practical sense, it was a divorce. In practical sense, he says, plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife and I am not her husband. That is words of divorce. That is actual language of a divorce in that time. What they would say is, you're not my wife. You're not my husband. And that would a public declaration, and then a proper set of following certain sequence of events. That would be a declaration that this is no longer. In other words, in our world, sometimes the words might be irretrievably broken. In other words, you're not me. So he repudiates. This repudiation is a saying that you're no longer who you thought you were, and I'm divorcing you in a practical sense in that time. And that stood as a thing that God says, I'm repudiating my people here, who was my wife, my people. And so that's the first thing. He says, I'm putting you away, put away. He said, and why is the reason? He gives a reason why. There's always a reason. Now, we have and I'll quickly make an application here that I think is very informative. That was the way it was for a long time in our practical culture, even our modern culture. However, because it had some sort of, that required some sort of judgment by somebody sitting in a bench somewhere to decide if there was really grounds for this. I'm a child of divorce. I understand this. Okay, I've been around it a while. I understand how it works, and I understand that there was a judge who decided if there were grounds. So he would make a decision. Husband, wife, somebody has wronged somebody, and you can't get together. So boom. If he didn't think that there was reason, and I can tell you that I've heard it not in person, but I've heard it repeated exactly. Well, I don't really think that you guys, really want to do this, and you need to work back together, find a way to get back together. And of course, that was the judgment of the judge, so nothing happened. He signed nothing and everything. So, but the point is, so there is that was so onerous, according to people, that put so much pressure on the judges. That meant somebody had to be right, somebody wrong, and you couldn't just do it for anything if you didn't have grounds, that we come up with a cool modern cultural workaround where it's like having a game where everybody gets a trophy. There is no score, there are no grades, everybody gets a trophy because you showed up. They call it no fault. Just don't have to have a fault. Just because I don't want to. There's no fault in that. So they took away the idea that there must be some evidentiary reason, some sort of, and that's what it is. So in this day, it says here, why? Because if she put it away she'll tell her to do these things. What is he saying? I'm repudiating you. However, if you'll quit doing this stuff, there's a chance. These language that he's using here is that she's down at the temple as a wife of Hosea. She goes down to the temple and still does her temple prostitute work. This idea of adultery between her breasts, They wore certain jewelry and certain sorts of things that indicated who they were and what their purpose at the temple was. And so he says, get all that out of your life. Quit doing that. Don't go down there. That's the point. I'm trying to show you that. Now, the second thing, the second path, or the second sign on the road to judgment here is humiliation. Verse 3, lest, so notice, if you don't stop, here's the next sign. Lest I strip her naked and make her as in the day she was born, and make her like a wilderness, and make her like a parched land, and kill her with thirst. So what happens? This language here that he's using is actual practice. It was part of the actual practice at that time to outside of and even inside the children of Israel, outside the children of Israel. In other words, there's a symbolic, visible, just like he would declare, you would make a public declaration. There's a public display of the actuality that was going on. And it was also the same language that they used when a country or a nation or a large group of people were going to break a treaty. They used the language of strip you naked and take away everything. In other words, I'm breaking the treaty, and here's the words. It was also significant, and of course, again, we're looking at a culture here that has a little different view of it than we do, but in their time. But it was also this stripping away was the husband taking back everything that he had given to the wife. His job in that culture at time was to supply the needs of the family. The wife, make sure that she had a place to live, had food to eat. That was the job of the husband in that culture. And anyway, he was taking back his stuff. Everything that he had given, he's taking it all back. So technically, she was leaving as she came in. So this is a humiliation. If the repudiation doesn't get you, then the humiliation or humiliating of someone, the idea of this make you want to stop and think. And then we'll go on down to verse 4 and 5. So there's that point. Now verse 4 and 5 talks about, he says this extends. Now, so we're moving on to a new thing. We're repudiating, we're humiliating. That doesn't make you change your mind. Now we're going to disown or disowning. In the practical sense, they physically disowned. They said there's no mercy on the children. There's nothing going to change it. They're going to be stuck without a father, and in this case, and then because God points out she had these children in a shamefully. She wasn't faithful to Hosea the whole time, and matter of fact, one of the children, if not two of them, were from somebody else. Okay, the Bible indicates that one of them wasn't even Hosea's. She didn't father one of them, but he took them on as a family. That while he were married, her adulteries resulted in at least one child, and that was also, but these are shameful, and says, and verse 4 talks about that because they're children of whoredom, and verse 5 says, and he explains it, because her mother did these things. She conceived him, acted shamefully, and she even says, well, you're going to take back all your stuff, I'll just go back to my other people, my other lovers, these ones that came to the temple to worship. Of course, in the picture, big picture, it was a picture of Israel saying, well, we'll make these treaties. And by the way, and don't lose track of the history here, in that time frame, Israel was busy trying to make treaties with the Assyrians, with the Egyptians, with this group and that group to thwart off things that were happening around them and what would ultimately be their judgment. They were trying to form these treaties with other pagan nations, which God had told them not to do. Okay? Because that tied them to them and put them in a place they didn't need to be. He says, you don't need to do that. I'll take care of you. Well, of course, they forgot about that. They lost track of that. They somehow had said, and by the way, I'll leave you to make this application. They somehow said, well, this is how God's going to help us. We're going to need to go down here and steal some stuff so God can help us. We're going to need to go down here and lie about something so God can help us. We're going to need to go and do this. Whereas they basically said, God is going to help us because he wants us to do something he told us that we weren't supposed to do. See, because they lost sight of what God's word said, and they needed to bend it around to make it fit what they wanted to do. This is what people are doing today. Anyway, so he basically then disowns them. Disowns them means that he is no longer their father in the big picture. I'm no longer the father of these people I've chosen, which was a big deal. It was a casting. This disowning of God says, I'm disowning you because you have disowned me. You've violated me. You've done all these things. I'm disowning. So the idea was so that they then would stop and go, whoa, wait a minute, hold on. We don't want that. We didn't mean for that to happen. How did that come about? Jeremiah talks about the same thing when he writes in chapter 2, verse 23, and the other prophets all deal with this in different ways. But Jeremiah says, how can you say, chapter 2, verse 23, I am not defiled, I am not run after the Baals. See how you have behaved in the valley. Consider what you have done. You are a swift she-camel running here and there. Verse 24, a wild donkey accustomed to the desert, sniffing the wind in her craving, in her heat, who can restrain her? Any males who pursue her need not tire themselves. At mating time, they will find her. What does he say? That's a metaphor. That's an illustration of the people of God who are chasing after these other. These other guys don't have to chase after them. They chase after these other gods. It's easy. It'll be easy. You'll be easy to find because you want it so bad. So he disowns them. There's no father. The fourth thing on the list on the road to judgment I see here is found in verses 6 and first part of 7. Notice now there is this therefore. Whenever you see a therefore, wonder why it's therefore, right? That's the old saying. We'll word that out. I'm sorry, but it's worth noting. I usually highlight them or underline them or something so I can say, okay, whatever there was going on up here, now we understand this. So therefore, something's going to happen, right? Therefore, God says, this is what I'll do. I will hedge her up. What does that mean? Well, in the practical sense, Hosea said, I'm not going to let her leave the house. I'm not going to let her go down to the temple. I'm going to keep her at home. In the bigger picture of what God did with Israel, he says, I'm going to fix it so they are stuck. They can't get out away from it. They cannot make these interactions. In other words, I'm going to block or avoid, or I'm going to do something, right? And this will stop her from doing it. Now, I don't know if you have this experience with children or not, because I was a child, and I'm sure everybody here was a child, and you might have some experience. But you can ground them, you can be grounded, you can be blocked. But guess what? It might stop you from moving, but it ain't change your thinking, right? She got blocked. There's a sense of avoid, verse 7, if you go down there, and then what's the response? He's going to block her, then what's she going to do? Verse 7, she shall pursue her lovers, but not overtake them. He said she's going to keep on chasing after them, but she won't catch up with them because I'm blocking her. And that's fine. However, avoidance and blocking doesn't work very long, because as soon as the blockage is removed, or something, we're going, why? Because we're blocking somebody who's trying to go somewhere. The idea is on the road to judgment is we stop going down the road. Don't. You see it on TV all the time. People put railroad things down and people drive around it. People put blocks in the road and people drive around it. And then they run into something and everybody's shocked. Most especially the person who runs into something. It don't work because they haven't got the message. And anyway, he goes on there to say that. So avoidance of blocking. When you notice there's a blockade, it might be a time to start thinking about it. To avoid the whole problem, stop. Right? Don't go around it. Don't avoid the blocking. Respond to it by saying, wait a minute, why am I getting this block? I wasn't expecting this. But of course, on the path, it gets steeper and steeper. That's why this road is slippery and sloping and it keeps multiplying. Now, the next thing I see here is in number 5 on my list of 6 things, by the way, is in the second half of verse 7 and down in 8. So after he's blocked and after she keeps him from going, right? He blocks in that sense. What is her response? Oh, wow, I didn't know I'd done all this stuff. I didn't know it. Wow, I need to turn around here right now and fall on my face and pray to God and ask God to forgive me. I need to change my behavior, all that stuff. Nope. Now then becomes an indication of our heart. What I call selfishly returning. Selfishly returning. What? Then that's this Gomer in the case of Hosea, and Israel in the case of the bigger picture of God, and us and everybody else who does it. Then she will say, I will go and return to my first husband. For it was better for me then than now, and she did not know that it was I. Notice, what is he saying? He said, well, you got this block, I'll come back. I'll go back Why is she going back? Look at the reasons. Yes, going back was the point. Stop and turn around. But the reason is critical. That's why if you look at it in verse 8 there, he says, I gave her all these things and who lavished on this, and you used them for Baal. So she has turned around because why? Because she has run into a roadblock, and I'll go back, but she still doesn't know who gave it to her. He says, she did not know. Now, this does not mean that God prevented her from knowing. It just means that she has not realized yet who gave her this stuff. She went back to her first husband because she ran out of stuff and ran into a roadblock. So she turned around like some people do because they're in a crisis at that moment, and they turn back around toward the church or turn back around toward Christianity, but they still haven't figured out the bottom problem. They haven't understood that the root of this is their attitude, their actions, and so in a sense they didn't know. That doesn't mean they didn't know they were kept in the dark. It means that they didn't want to know. You see, when you don't want to do something, one of the things you do is don't know. Have you ever seen the picture of the dogs on Jan has all these things that she shows me all the time, and we all laugh about it. And it's like a kid. There's some connection there. However, the dog, and the mom or the house, or the father, the parents, I say mom, the parents or the owners of the dog, get that right. Owners of the dog or the parents of the child come home and begin to scold or notice that the house is torn all to shreds, and there's the dogs. It's amazing to me what they understand. I don't know. There's all kinds of speculation on it, but here's what I do see. The picture shows it. And they start talking about something that's wrong. The voice, the tone, the eyes, they're at least reading your expressions. They get the picture something is bad, wrong, and you're talking them. And what the dog does? Now, in the cartoon world, what happened is it's the ostrich. Remember, I don't know if this is true or not, but the ostrich is this ginormous bird with this tiny little head. Whenever the ostrich is hiding, all he does is stick his head in the hole, and supposedly, he's convinced he's hiding. Of course, this ginormous, the huge part of them is showing, and the kid's like, if you don't look at me and I don't look at you, then it didn't happen. I didn't do it. I don't know anything about it. If they're still there, the guilt is all over it. And so we avoid, we turn away. And so we really are not willing to admit it or anything like that. And she wants to return back to these things. Because remember, part of this first love of hers was also she was already hooked onto the Baals. And so that's also a factor here. She really wasn't, for her first love, really wasn't God. It was the Baals. And that's where he found her at. So in that sense, she's turning back to why? Because of resources. He goes on to say, he said, it's all about the gold and the silver. That's what she wants. All the things she just got lost or she was humiliated in that humiliation phase, she wants them back now. But she hasn't really changed. We know this because we see that. What happens this is not new because the psalmist writes about it in Psalm 24:1 when he talks about this. And I'll read it. Psalm 24:1. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, and the world and all who live in it. For he founded it on the seas and established it on the waters. That's verse 2, and you could go on. In other words, verse 1 says, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. You see, when people don't want to believe that or refuse to accept that, then whatever they got it themselves, or somebody gave it, or this I did this and I got that. They forgot that all of this stuff, our even life, the very existence of us, is a gift of God. The place we live on, we claim to, be worried about and all this kind of stuff. And all the universe we look out to see and everything, that was God. That's God's. He was the one who makes all that stuff. He's in charge of it. There was nothing she got from the Baal gods. There was nothing that you get from anything that God didn't already own, invent, make, discover. Not discover, he created it, and then he let us discover it, and he lets us have access to it. But it was still his, and it's always been his. And when you stop and think about it, in order to make you change. But see, Israel forgot that. They kept forgetting it. They kept putting it aside. They don't want to think about that. They want to think about how great they are. That's why on Jesus' day, they were still working on the fact that you got a lot of stuff because you must have been pleasing to God. They didn't realize there was a lot of stuff out there God gives people. But that doesn't mean you're pleasing. It just means you got a lot of stuff. Maybe you are, maybe you aren't. They couldn't get their head around that because they like to have the quid pro quo. They love that get. You get, this is a church today. Give us some stuff. We'll give you some stuff. If you don't give me some stuff, I ain't coming. Instead of coming to give something, as I said last week in worship, they came to get. But no getting, no giving. I'll vote with my pocketbook. We're always in the business of trading things because we think somehow or other that's because we're supposed to have it and we're going to get it. And somebody gave it to us, so we owe them some allegiance in one way or the other. And the fact of the matter is, God says, I gave it all. There is nothing anybody has, and out of nothing I made it all, including you. So the judgment that which follows in verses 9 through 13 makes perfect sense. He says again, notice there, therefore, because you haven't changed your mind and because you haven't really accomplished anything, and because you really are still not getting the message, then I'm going to take back everything. Now he goes to the agricultural illustration. I'm going to take back all the agricultural products that you have been counting on and everything you cover yourself up with. And so you'll be completely naked. And now then, you'll get a picture of what you really have. Even though that's not everything, because I'm in fact still here. And that hopefully you'll realize that God made you too. And then I'm going to put an end to all this mirth. I love that. That's joy making this. You're celebrating what? All these festivals. The Israelites had feasts and festivals and their calendars marked by it, and still got them today. I mean, they still mark the calendar by these things. We can read about them, and you can go on and Google it and look at their festival days and all this stuff and all these things. And people still going through the motions. And he says, I'm going to do all these. He said, I'm getting rid of all this. I'm going to lay waste to everything. You're not going to have anything. This is coming true in the real sense for them, as it does always. He says, they're not going to be nothing. He says, I'm going to punish you for these feast days because, see, they had their Yahweh feast or God feast that God prescribed in the Bible, and then they had their other feasts of their other gods. Okay, so they do this. So, here's a question we need to answer, and we'll get to it. The answer is this. What's the question? Is what gods have we blended in today in the 21st century? You see, this all is interesting, and maybe I don't know, it's Bible stuff, so you can say, I read the Bible, and some of you watching may read the Bible and go, okay, that's really great. But, I don't worship Baal, and I don't do this, and I don't do that, and blah, blah, blah. And that's what we always do. We got an excuse, we got a reason that somehow it doesn't apply to us. Go get them, Robbie, because there's plenty of people like that, but not me. So what gods have we blended? What syncretism are we today? The people outside of the church, outside the body of believers. And by the way, when I say the church, I'm not talking about a building. I'm not talking about a set of denominational rules. I'm talking about the body of believers. The Bible says, and Paul tells us that the church is a body of baptized believers. Period. They're a body of baptized. In other words, that whole thing means something. There was a group of people, right, who were baptized, and he didn't just mean got wet and check box 1, good to go. He meant that signified a serious belief in Jesus Christ and what it was. That was what he was saying. Like anything we do, we assume people know what we're meaning. Paul was talking, he said, this is what it is. It's not just anything you want it to be. It's not a building, a place, a house, whatever in his day. It isn't today. It won't be ever. It's about a group of people. So when I say that, so then what has the world done today to mix things together? How's the people outside the body of believers, and how are the body of believers affected by this? What have we blended in? Oh, we never blended. Oh, yes. I beg to differ. Outside in the world, they treat God the same way. What do? They worship different things. Well, we don't worship, this and that and the other. In a sense, there's some of this stuff that's terribly real in our modern worship practice, but in modern world, the world worships. But what does the world worship? In one say, you can kind of generalize it under a few headings. One of them is power, the God of power. People want to be in power. That's all they do. All their life, all they're trying to do is get to be in charge, be in power of something. Whatever level that achieve, whatever their goal is, that's what they're looking for. Prosperity. People want to be wealthy. They want to have stuff. That's what they work. That's all they do. That's what they focus. Possessions, things, right? They have to have things, because that's also a sign of prosperity and usually a result of some sort of power. And they want position, which also goes along with some of these others. In other words, they want to achieve a certain position in life. Oh, look at so-and-so. You can tell their position. They have a position. So these are the things the world has called, that the Bible would call the Baals. They worship them. They take and they put, and I'll tell you one more that you hadn't thought of. People. Sometimes we get to where we want people so badly because God put that in us. We need fellowship, but we don't care who they are. As a matter of fact, we don't care at all what they think. We just need some people, and we'll do anything to get some people around us because they represent some security and some sort of assurance that's something that they make us feel good. We get around some people, and what happens? We get around like-minded people. Why? Because what assurance is there, what security is the people who disagree with you. So we get like-minded people around, the world does, and they get them together, and they tell each other how great they are, to tell each other what they're doing is fine, what I'm doing is fine. So quid pro quo goes on, everybody does that, and God is not got anything to do with it. Because if it did, none of them be doing the right thing, and so they don't want to hear about that. They have a too much amount of concern about their status or their success or the trophies that these things bring, and they're all different. That's the world. The world that denies God, whether they agree that they do or not, they practically do, and some of them openly do. They basically don't declare God as no effect. And their God is not a biblical God, and the reason I know that is because they don't have a biblical God. The biblical God hasn't changed at all. But they have accommodated all these different things. Now, what's the church? Well, the church has done the same thing. The church takes things and accommodates. The church is doing exactly what the Israelites. The Israelites came in with this decree from God. I am the God and there are no others. Do not. I'm giving you this, and I promise this and I promise that. And therefore, you know I'm going to make it happen. Now, how it's going to happen and when it's going to happen and all this kind of stuff, yes, I'm not telling you all that right now or ever or whatever, but it's going to happen. And if you believe I am who I say I am the I am, then you will know that I'm able to do it, and I will do it because I said so, because I'm that God. And quite frankly, I know that's kind of tough. I tell people all the time, it's a lot harder than you think. But when you believe God is who He is, and it's a faith statement. I have faith that God is who He is, and that He'll do what He said and done what He said, and He'll do it. I can't, I can't give you a zillion different things. At that point, you made a statement of faith. Now then you listen to what does He say He's going to do, and how does that affect me, and so on, right? So what happens is the church does this. Church gets out of focus. That's what happened to the Israelites. They begin to find, in a modern church, the world today, church today, they get devotion. They get devoted to the wrong things. They devoted to their heritage. They get devoted to traditions. They get devoted to numbers. They get devoted to buildings, to programs, to popularity. Any and all these things are not, in one sense, a terrible thing. When they become, like a lot of things, terrible and bad, is when, what? When they become the thing that gets in God's place. And it's always a little here and a little there. When what God has said is no longer enough, and these things are more important than what God said, they take the place of God. Now, nobody is doing this agrees with this. They're seldom ever going to say, well, we've done that. But when you look at it, it's there. And that's what the church does. They get locked into something, and it becomes more important than what God said. They've lost sight of the big picture here, God's picture, and it becomes that. They are good, but they become our passion rather than pursuit of God, and the following of God is our passion. These things become our passion. There are people I know who are wonderful people. I no doubt they believe in God and they've given their life to Him. However, they pursue these at the cost of everything else. This is all that matters. This is their measure of success. Programs, popularity, traditions, numbers, heritage. And that becomes their Baal, and that becomes their false god, and they then become the Gomer, the illustration. And so we need to realize that those things take away our dependence on God. We depend on this or that, and therefore then we are in trouble. We fear, and this was brought out in the Sunday school lesson, I thought, well, won't rehash that, but we fear these things. We fear the government, we fear the world, we fear this, we fear that, we fear, and this is a modern term, you're going to become irrelevant. Let me tell you something. When God has become irrelevant, I'll be irrelevant. When God, and by the way, there are people who think God is irrelevant. But a lot of Christian people say that God's not relevant anymore. God is always relevant, and they're doing something that's irrelevant, or they're irrelevant, but God is not irrelevant. His word is still his word. It's never irrelevant. And what comes is people say, well, we've got to make his word relevant to the culture. Well, we need to address the culture. I agree with that. But we need to address it in the terms that God does. I am God and there is no other. So if this part of this thing you want to do in your life is more important to me and you need me to redefine me to get that work, then you missed it. I'm still going to be where I am and you're still going to be where you are, outside the gate. You see, when people start thinking that, when people think that somehow some human being, the Pope, the preacher, the president, the this guy, the that guy, holds me in their hand and is holding my life and says, this is what you are and you are, then we have missed the fact that God says, oh, I don't know about that. Well, I don't believe that. He says, I'm your mine and I hold you. And I've got you, and whatever I promise you, you're going to get. But here's the thing. You're giving your allegiance. You're letting these people manipulate you, and you're pushing me aside. Now, you would say I'm not, but you are. It's a practical sort of thing. You can look at it. Who's got the rule? Who gets to say the final say? Right before Jan is God. You understand that the final say, there is a final say. You have to say, what does God think about this? And that's all that matters. So the question we ask ourselves today as we close is, what gods have we blended? What gods are we blended into our life? Are we on a path of judgment? Have we noticed a sign? Did we stop and turn around? And if not, will we? That's the question. God says, will you come unto me? Will you repent of these? Will you put these things aside in the proper place? I'm not saying they don't exist. I'm not saying they aren't happening. But will you put them where they go? And trust me. And when we do, then what he says, will you receive Christ as your Savior? Will you trust God trust me that I have given you Christ, who all your salvation is in him? Trust me. You can turn around. You can stop at any sign because you're on the road to judgment. Would you pray with me this morning?